I realize we don't have anybody here.
I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Is that okay? Upcoming events for the Preservation Association of Lincoln. Our next brown bag is also Jim McKee, so that'll be number 21. Today's number 20, so that's all. And our monthly board meeting is tomorrow evening at Lincoln High at 7:30. Right.
And it's in room 101.
Oh yeah, we're not meeting in the library this time. We're in room 101. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker.
It was a good introduction. I liked it.
Thank you. I thought they were ready.
Well, you are really.
I had to run out and put a quarter in the meter.
I guess.
A handful of quarters.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one.
Sorry.
Wake up call.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Birch and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Today is the 20th of a series of lectures with Jim McKee. Support for this series is provided by Speedway Properties. Please join me in thanking Speedway Properties for their generous support of the videotaping. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books, and a coinery. Jim has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is the 20th of a series of talks for the next couple of years. This title is Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 20. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
And then last time I did number 19 in the series of 12. Now it's number 20 in the Never Ender series. We had no idea what we were getting into when we started this. And Eileen emailed me a couple weeks ago and asked me, when, if ever, will this end? And I said, no end is in sight, partially because we keep inventing new history every day, I reckon. Well, we're going to start this time with the old library, which sits on the site where the Bennett Martin Public Library sits. But we'll start well before that, when library in Lincoln was not a library and it was not a public library. Very early on, there were two competing libraries in the city of Lincoln, and there being no provision under the legislature for city financing of libraries anywhere in the state of Nebraska, one was set up, the Young Ladies Reading Room. The other was the Young Men's Library. So two separate individual libraries working in the same direction. Finally, in 1875, they decided that they would attempt to bring these two groups together, at least as one central library, if not a public library. They called a group of people together, and it's the people you might think of if you look back in the city of Lincoln, including people like Charles Gear, who wanted to put together a library. They put out a call within the city for anyone who could to donate things like books, shelves, anything that was usable. They said the largest gift that came out of that was from a man by the name of Prosper Smith, who gave a set of encyclopedias, which brought the total number of books between the two libraries to 376 books. They also started soliciting members because it couldn't be paid for by the city. It couldn't be a city library at that time. They had 130 members who paid $1 a year for membership, and 12 life members who paid I'm not sure what. They also had $984 in their treasury, so they were in pretty good shape. They hired a lady to be the first librarian. Her name was Ada Van Pelt. I have no idea. If somebody's going to ask me if she was related to Robert Van Pelt, I have no idea in the world. Mayor Silver, at that time, the mayor, proposed giving some money to the library, but the city council vetoed it, and probably because there was no provision, as I said, in the legislature for city libraries, so the city probably was pretty hamstrung on that. But in 1887, the mayor of the city was a man named Mr. Hardy, and Mayor Hardy was a Methodist, and he ran the Anti-Saloon League, for example, and was twice the mayor of the city of Lincoln. And he ordered that $100 be donated to the library system. And at that time, it's unclear whether the legislature had acted yet or not. But anyway, in accepting the $100, it was considered that the library became a public library and was part of the city of Lincoln. But it's a little bit nebulous. The board members each rotated being the librarian. They came and sat in for a day or a week and were the librarians. Funds dwindled, and Miss Van Pelt had to be dismissed. By 1880, they had 1,800 books, 9 daily newspapers, 20 weekly newspapers, and 15 magazines. They moved around from rented room to rented room in downtown, mostly centering around, but not quite at 12th and L. Usually the second floor of an office building, and it must have gotten quite difficult to keep moving all those books. But finally, in 1898, they were able to secure a room above the Masonic Temple. The Masonic Temple, unfortunately, 1 year later, virtually, on September the 6th of 1899, decided to burn to the ground, and with it, it's going to take the library. 1:30 a.m., it was the 5th fire in Lincoln that day. Volunteer fire department still in 1899. So the library was pretty much a loss, and they knew that whatever books they had in the collection of the Lincoln City Library were those which had been checked out. And they checked the number, and of course this is one of those numbers that you got to say, well, that's a little bit too coincidental to be true. But they said, and we'll have to assume it's true, 376 books, which was the exact number they had when they started the first library some years before. So whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it makes a great story, and we'll stick with it because it's in print someplace else. In fact, it was in print by Mrs. Stephen Pound, who wrote the first history of the Lincoln City Libraries. And certainly if her husband had anything to say about it, it would have been accurate because he was a very, very careful man. The first thing that happened at that point with the library itself gone was that Mrs. William Jennings Bryan was sort of appointed the head of a committee to approach Mr. Carnegie to find out if he would give the money for a library. And she found out what everybody found out that contacted the Carnegie Library system, and that was Mr. Carnegie did not give anybody funds to start a library. That wasn't how it worked. He would, if you sent in a proposal and an architectural submission included, and he liked it, he would put up to 50% of the funds to build a library. But there were a lot of requirements. He oftentimes didn't like what architects had in mind for a library, and he would change minor little details, it seems today. But he had very much of a hands-on in designing all those Carnegie libraries across the United States, 3,000 as a matter of fact. And there were a few scattered around all over the world. But he would change little things like the way a room was accessed. He was very, very careful. Basically, he said he would give 50% of the funds to build a library. The city had to make a provision that it would support the library. So he wanted to know that if he put 50% into it, a year later the library wouldn't close. He also would, in some cases, give extra money for things like shelving, but he didn't want to do that. He thought the community ought to be invested in this library. There also was no requirement whatsoever that it be called a Carnegie Library. You know, you could either name it after an individual in the city, you could call it the Lincoln Library, whatever you wanted. So although we refer to this as the Carnegie Library, and it usually is, wasn't necessarily true. They looked around downtown Lincoln, tried several different locations, even had an option on some property, but finally chose the lots on the northeast corner of 14th and N Streets. The building will be built here for $75,000 plus $2,000. They go back to him and get more funds to help build the shelving. Unfortunately, the city of Lincoln wasn't able to raise their entire half of the proposed cost of the building, which is around $75,000. They went back to Mr. Carnegie, and he, in very unusual situation, gave 50% of the remaining 50%. So he really gave Lincoln a little more than he would give almost anyone else. The Zemer House, by the way, was located on this corner. And we think of the Zemer House as being Maple Lodge at 20th and Euclid, but that was a subsequent house. Mr. Zemer, who ultimately built, we'll divagate here, we'll drift from the subject. Mr. Zemer, who owned a railroad ticket agency, primarily Burlington, but you could buy a ticket from him from any railroad or a steamship ticket to Europe, whatever. His building was on the northeast corner of 10th and O Streets, the Zemer Ticket Agency. His wife had a lot of money, and when she inherited all that money, he built a new house, which we think of as Maple Lodge or the old Redstone, on the northeast corner of 20th and Euclid. Okay, got it? That's where my granddaughter lived there for a long time, and now her mother resides in the house. So, interesting. Okay, Mr. Zemer. At any rate, his house was there. Property was acquired, the building was built, dedicated in 1902, and will ultimately end up being one of 5 Carnegie Libraries in the city of Lincoln. Mr. Carnegie's original intent was not really to give more than one library to any city. Ultimately, we'll see that he does give money to start another one in a minute, but the other 3 in Lincoln were not given to Lincoln. He gave money to Havelock, a separate city, University Place, a separate city, and Bethany, and so forth. These were separate, not part of the city of Lincoln. The building as we see it here from the exterior, I presume a lot of you remember. It is exactly as I remember it. Mrs. Stephen Pound, as I mentioned, wrote a history of the library, and she wrote that in 1916. The building, she said, was a cube. Looked like a cube exactly, 68 by 104 feet, to which were added 2 additions, one 20 by 43 and one 19 by 27. So for all intents and purposes, a cube with some extensions on it. Those weren't additions later on, they were original additions. Made of gray pressed brick and terracotta with a red tile roof, and the entrance was an easy flight of stairs. I don't think the ADA would look at anything as an easy flight of stairs anymore, but you know, those of us who remember it, you did have to walk up on any public building, virtually had to walk up steps. And in this case, it was what we would call, or I would call, I should say, a sunlight basement, where later the children's reading room will be. So you could walk in and go down in the basement or the half basement to the children's library, but basically they wanted you to go up this flight of stairs into the vestibule, which she said was made of Tennessee marble. Now, I think we decided, did we not, Matt, that there is no marble in Tennessee, so it was something else. But at any rate, they called it marble. And the rest of that entranceway was made of Keen's cement. Never heard of Keen's cement before. Bob says I should have, but I haven't. One of the things we should think about, too, is that little fence that's around the building, because people always, after I'm done, want to say, what's left of the building? Well, that little fence is partly left. This is a vantage of the back of the building, and you can see, looking at it from this vantage, that it's a pretty good-sized building. And you can also see one of the pop-outs in the back, which made it not directly a cube. Really, it's a one-floor building with a walk-in basement, so it's really only what most people would call a one-floor, one-story building. This is taken from the old corn popper, by the way. And at this point in time, this picture was taken in 1916. This is the interior. This is the circulation desk, where if you walked up that flight of stairs towards the east, you would have come up and into this room. Around the corner up at the top, you can see the little vignettes, if you will, of American authors. And that's one of the things that people also ask about, was when the building was torn down, what became of those? Well, Sid Connor wasn't around, apparently. They tried everything they could think of to get them out of there, but they were unable to salvage any of them, so they did not. Well, in the meantime, after the fire, the library moved over on Q Street into what today has Kinko's in it on the southeast corner of 11th, I think it is, and Q. That building was built for the Husong Motor Company, and out of that building they originally sold tractors, farm implements, as well as trucks and Ford vehicles before they went over onto O Street. And built the building, which most of us remember as the Duteau Chevrolet building, but it started at Husong Ford. So they got that building, and they rented the upstairs and moved the library over there. The building, when it was completed here, had room for 33,000 books. This is the reading room. What a cherry-looking spot it is. Ultimately, by the time the library has grown to its full use, the shelves for 33,000 books had over 200,000 books on them. So it wasn't that we didn't use the building carefully. This is the stacks, and this is the building coming down. About 1960, the building is torn down. The old fence, I said, is left. And part of that is around the South Branch Library on 27th and South. Part of it is at the Children's Zoo, or it was at the Children's Zoo. They keep moving things and destroying things, so I have no idea whether those are left or not. It was originally around what was called a flamingo pool. I don't think the flamingo pool is even in there anymore, so who knows. Bennett Martin's house also had a piece of that fence around it as well, which makes sense because Bennett Martin was one of the primary benefactors of the new library. Some of the exterior lights were put around the Birdcage Theater as well. Let's see if we have one more picture of the library. I don't think we do. No, we'll go back. In 1907, the city of Lincoln started taking truckloads of books out to a grocery store at 27th and Holdridge Streets. And they would put the books in there as a circulating library. And then every Saturday, they would take a new load out and take back the old. So it was kind of, they would kept changing the collection at 27th and Holdridge until 1909. The Northeast Branch Library was built, and then that was Carnegie funded as well, on 27th and Orchard, so a couple blocks up from Holdridge. And that building, the one on 27th and Orchard, is the one which ends up at 27th and way the heck north. I don't know what street it would be. It's north of the city water department and just south of the overpass over the railroad tracks. I don't know what street it is, but they moved it out there. And I remember, Matt, that they came to the Lincoln Coin Club and said if we literally gave them our entire treasury because we wanted to be able to meet in the building, So we turned over, at that time, several $100s so that we could meet in the building. They did move the library. It took a long time to get it completed. And as soon as they did, they decided there would be no outside meetings in it. So we contributed to the library for sure. An aerial view of the city of Lincoln. We're looking from the Capitol, the first Capitol, probably. It's exactly when, I don't know, but we're looking towards the northwest. We can see a number of things in Lincoln. Let's see, does this have a little pointer on it? It does. Let's see if I can figure out how to make it work. The thing that we're going to talk about right now is this building right here. This, of course, would be back here, 13th Street. So this is 14th Street. You'll notice, too, that people were, as they do when you have an empty lot, they take shortcuts. Part of that reason was, of course, none of the streets were paved, so if it got muddy, they would simply head off in some grass, or in this case, they were taking shortcuts down towards the city of Lincoln. Not much visible in that picture, except the building that we want to talk about right here. There are other things, but they don't make much sense. We can see that the fence around the Capitol building grounds has been added. Now, we're at 1866. We've moved along that far in our program already. So if you want to know how many more programs there are, you can kind of figure that. But remember, current history is boring as hell. All right. Now, history, as I've told you before, and maybe you don't remember, but history starts in 1940. So really, everything after 40 is kind of just commonplace. It's not really history, right? You knew that 1940 was the division point? Gene did not. No. Why is 1940 the division point? It's because that's the year I was born. And everybody, I think in their own mind, thinks of everything within their lifetime as not really being history, but, you know, current events. So we're going back to 1866. Now, we'll speak briefly before that, because in 1863, the first church service was held in Lancaster County. That was Methodist Church, of course. Methodist circuit riders were coming through here mostly at that time. Then on August the 19th of 1866, the first church in the city of Lincoln, or excuse me, in Lancaster, the city, was formed, and that was called the Congregational Church of Lancaster. Now, the interesting sort of dichotomy, or whatever the word would be, is that the city of Lincoln, or Lancaster as was then known, literally the entire plat, was owned by the Methodist Church. But the Methodists did not establish the first church here. The first church was the Congregational Church. And where did they establish themselves? In the Methodist Church building. But the Methodist Church as an organization still didn't exist. They had built a building. They had also built in 1864 the Methodist Protestant Female Seminary, which you remember back, I think, on our very earliest program, was the first building of any consequence to be built in Lancaster. It was a masonry building, several stories tall, and in that building is where the Congregational Church organized itself, meaning that the organization was the first and therefore preceded the Methodists. Now, the reason for that was the Methodist Protestant Church did not allow a congregation to form a church, like incorporate, until there was a specified number of members. Until that time, they were allowed to start what they called a Sunday school. The Sunday school would grow to a certain number, and we've tried to figure out exactly what that number is, but it doesn't seem to be recorded very well anyplace. But when it reached a certain number, the Sunday school could form what they called a Methodist station. And then after that number grew again, the station could be organized as a church. Well, at that point in time, they didn't have enough to have anything more than a Sunday school. So they met there and organized in that building. They will hold services around the corner from the building, still in the same block, in the First Methodist Church building, which is where the parking garage is in the Journal-Star block. That's where the first church building of any consequence was built, and it faced towards the east, a tiny little frame building. And interestingly, too, that is where the governor held his reception in 1867, coming to then. In 1867, Lancaster became Lincoln, and that's where he held his reception. Just a tiny little wooden chapel. So, where are we? Okay. In 1869, roughly, they will build this building, which they call a chapel. And the best way to explain it's on 13th Street, but it would sit roughly where the Miller Time pub is in the Cornhusker Hotel. At that point in history, we remember that the Capital Commission had stipulated that any church organization that wanted could apply for and receive 3 lots in the plat of the city of Lincoln. The reason for that was they felt that the capital of Nebraska should not have just a Methodist church and a Congregational church, that it should be much more diverse, so they offered anybody that wanted. Almost immediately, 10 church organizations applied for and received lots. It's a little bit of a misleading statement, though, because 3 of the 10 were Methodists. There was a Methodist Protestant, a Methodist Episcopal, and a German Methodist church. So still, the Methodists had their finger in there pretty deeply. And we could go into that in detail if Bob looks curious about maybe the most interesting thing about it is the German Methodist Church, and a man by the name of Bax, B-A-X, was the sole person who might have applied for this, and he had no intention of it. But governor came to him and said, we want you to apply for this so that, that you have this site, even if you don't have need for it immediately. And Mr. Bax still drug his feet, and the governor said, I will pledge money to you to help you. And so very ecumenical. People were pledging money to churches that weren't their own to set aside. And the German Methodist Church ultimately will get going with several hundred people, but the Methodist Church, like all churches, divides and it comes together. And the Methodist Church that was started in Lincoln, the Methodist Protestant Church, at the same time Lancaster became Lincoln, started going out of business. The Methodists work slowly and grind finely. They started in roughly 1867 and completed it, correct me if I'm wrong, Lowell, 1937. So very careful, but they finally went out of business. Well, we went way away from what we were thinking of. Okay, that little building is what they're going to erect first, that chapel. Now, this is a blow-up of the same area. Let's see, right? So right here, this is the building looking a little bit closer. You can see it didn't amount to very much. It was 25 by 40 feet and cost really an amazing, I thought, $2,800 after they added on to it. How they were able to spend that much, I don't know. It must have been fixturing or something, or there was tremendous graft involved. I have no idea. They spruced it up in 1878 a little bit. Then in 1883, they began planning a new building, which was dedicated in 1887, still on the same property, and that's this picture. This building sat right next to and south on the same block as the First Presbyterian Church. So they will share that facing of 13th. And all of the churches, of course, were downtown because that's as far as the plat went. There were churches which even later did apply for and got lots out of it, but basically those first 10 make the crux and all downtown. Then they will split off another church, which will be called the Second Congregational Church. And I'm not sure whether that's the next picture or not. Nope. This is the Presbyterian Church next door, just so you know. So it sat on the southwest corner of the intersection or the northeast corner of the block, 13th Street running in front of it here. Now, the Second Congregational Church began building a building at 17th and A Streets in what was a cornfield. And they will build this building. They spun off of First Congregational Church and built this little building. They organized in 1887. The building itself was built by the parishioners. It cost $200 to build, so that seems more realistic to me than the original one. The members cleared off some of the corn and built the building in a little over 2 days. And of course, that building will be replaced with this building. And our first real building, which was 1888, and dedicated, we're looking down 17th Street, looking towards the north in this picture. 17th Street didn't exist. That's why we're standing in a sidewalk looking towards the north. And we also, if we would go down today to that intersection, we would see that 17th Street makes a jog right there. The reason for this is multiple, probably. Can't speak with absolute authority, but streets don't always run straight as a string. O Street, for example, takes a turn at 27th Street, a bump, and it also takes one at 84th Street. And in those cases, they are sort of based on the fact that the earth, I didn't know this, but the earth is not flat. And being round, you have to make adjustments now and again. Now, some people have said that the 17th and A Street is an adjustment. I rather doubt it. My guess is probably what was going on is as the city of Lincoln expanded and different people would put subdivisions together, those subdivisions, they would plan them over here and over here, but as they grew towards each other, they didn't necessarily mesh. You get particularly down in that area, Rose and Plum and all those streets, they don't meet at all. And I think, and mostly it's due to the fact that subdivisions didn't meet. And Bob and Matt, you can correct me there. It's a guess, but nobody's going to know for sure. So it sits even not then on a corner, but this is the corner that they will sit on for a while. And that building, of course, as soon as they have it paid off, you build a new building. And this is the building that they built to replace it. In the meantime, Second Congregational Church has renamed themselves as Plymouth Congregational Church. This building is 1915, something like that. Then in 1923, and you're wondering why so much emphasis on this church, perhaps, it's because its anniversary, 150 years, comes just before the state of Nebraska, and I did a lot of research on it for that reason, because it's the oldest church. No other reason. Others will get treatment a little bit later on. 1923, a company called the Lancaster Hotel Corporation is formed. And they go to the Presbyterian Church and the Congregational Church and offer and ultimately do buy them out. So that both the Congregational and the Presbyterian churches will have to now build new buildings, or at least move out. And the Presbyterian Church will be built over at 17th and F, First Presbyterian. Now, the Congregationalists don't do exactly that immediately. What they do is they take the two churches and they meld them back together, so it becomes First Plymouth, or First-Plymouth Congregational Church. And they then, the new merged church, meets in this building, while they're beginning to plan a new building at 20th and D Streets. This is still there, and the last I heard, the Berean fundamentalists were in there for a while. Then it was, for a while, the Lutheran Church. Now, the Lutheran Church, its name changes through history, but for a while it's a Swedish Lutheran, and it mingles down. They moved in this building, and they're meeting there, and they are now known as First Lutheran Church, and they're going to move out to 70th and Sumner, roughly. And that's another story. We'll probably get to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the old Swedish Lutheran Church shortly. Probably not today. So, 1923, they're going to merge First and Plymouth as First Plymouth, and they're going to begin planning their new building at 20th and D Streets. Let's look what's next. Yep.
In the top of that slide, are those wires for streetcars?
The question is, are the wires that show up in the top of the slide streetcars? There are streetcars. There's a web up above directly in the intersection, and the other wires you see on poles, those would be just telephone and electric wires. But yeah, there was a streetcar line that came from downtown, and they jigged around, but it went out 17th Street and connected to 17th and South Streets roughly, where a man had started a subdivision. And the subdivision was designed around a park, which is a good thing for subdivisions to do. And his park, there's a remnant of it left today, and that's that little lake down on Lake Street, and what would that be, 11th, 10th, 11th, something like that. The other end of his park went clear up to the Roman Catholic school on 17th, and what would that be? Is it Lake, right there? And in fact, all of that land in between there was this park. It had a ballpark, because this guy was also very interested in baseball. 2 words, baseball. He promoted a baseball team. He had an amusement park in there, not with rides, but with boating and stuff like that. And that church school and church, if you go to the church school and look in the back, there's a mural painted there, and it shows the baseball field that was located about where that Catholic school is. And of course, ultimately, Lincoln General Hospital gets built in that area too. But the Lake Street Park, and then that park, is the whole park called Lake Street? I'm not sure, but you know, it runs in kind of a little. Irvingdale Park is part of it. And Stransky, right, Ann, yeah. So there are three little parks, kind of all connected together like a chain of parks. Boy, you didn't think you were going to get that much out of that question, did you? Did I finish that question? I don't know. Okay. Well, at any rate, this gentleman built the trolley car line out there because trolleys were also a good way to fill up lots and to sell people, and that's why Sheridan Boulevard developed and so forth. We can go into that a little bit later. Okay, so they're there. And I think now we're going to talk about Third Congregational Church. Now, Third Congregational Church will start in a grocery store on O Street. It'll then move to a rented room on N Street. It kind of goes around, and it's really more of a Sunday school than it is a church. But it keeps moving around and moving around. Finally, they will really buy in 1890 a lot on the southeast corner of 25th and what today is Vine Street. Now, when you look at the plat of Lincoln originally, you see A, B, C, D, E, A through Z streets, and V Street. Now, V Street ran up to about 14th Street when suddenly and miraculously it became Vine Street. So they bought at 25th and Vine. Now all those streets are contiguous and it's all Vine Street, but there used to be a U Street, or downtown it was called University Place was the name of the street. That became U Street, so we changed the name of the streets through the years a little bit. Okay, 25th and Vine. This is what sits on the corner of 25th and Vine. This is the Vine Congregational Church. It's had several names through the years, but it's settled on Vine Congregational Church. When they decided to move a couple of blocks to the south, they sold the church. It was turned 90 degrees and turned into a larger house. Now I think it's probably an apartment, but I'm not sure. It still sits there, but there's no evidence of it ever having been the church. So they will sit there. Then in 1905, they will move to S Street, 25th and S Street. Now they have to make a decision. They're no longer on Vine Street. What are we going to name the church? Well, they looked in the Bible and they discovered there in John, there's a statement that says, I am the vine, you are the branches, or something very close to that. So we figured we can still be Vine Congregational Church. So they move it over to 25th and S and build a building there. And that's this building, which is also still there. They also built a parsonage across the street, or a manse, or whatever the Congregationalists call their home for the minister. The building is there. It's been added on to and has been undergoing a lot of structural reinforcements and so forth. So Vine moves over there. Then in 1958, they will move again way out to the east to Twin Ridge Road, 1800 Twin Ridge Road. And at that point, this will be sold. It becomes many churches again. The Mennonites have it for a while. The last I knew, it was called Christ's Temple. And they were trying to raise money to reinforce the walls at that point in time. And I think they must have gotten it done, because I think the church is still there. But we're getting a little outside of our what we wanted to talk about, and that was the first Plymouth Congregational Church, which at 20th and D. First, they buy the property out there, of course, and then begin planning, as the Capitol did, how to have the building designed, and they choose an architect, H. Van Buren McGonigal, who was one of the 10 finalists. I keep looking over here to make sure I'm on the right one. One of the 10 finalists for the design of the present Capitol building, H. Van Buren McGonigal. So he will ultimately get the nod to build this church. And sometimes it's called McGonigal's Church for that purpose. There's some great lore, which we think, looking back on it, is probably completely made up, but it's a great story. So, I'll tell it again. And Otis told the story, Otis Young, and I thought it was gospel, but there's absolutely nothing written down, no place is there any evidence that it's true. And when they hired Mr. McGonigal, of course, it was kind of like the Capitol building, kind of a competition. He submitted the winning design, and the story went, and here's where we put quotations around the story. He came back from New York, as he had probably been back to the site of the Capitol building, I don't know, but he came back and visited the site, and after he had turned in the winning design, asked for permission to alter it. And I think if you ever designed a church building, you've designed it for a committee. And if you've got approval, don't mess with it. But he said he wanted to change it. And the story went that as he had come by train from New York to Lincoln, that he had seen things in the countryside that he thought he wanted to incorporate in the building, including the fact that there are a number of different colors of brick, and he wanted to represent each one of those naturally occurring colors in the countryside as a brick color. Secondly, this is the original sort of sketch of the building, and he had changed it so that one building disappears, which is in the foreground here on the right-hand side. That's where the columbarium is today. But originally the parish house was divided in half. He did away with that building. Then he said he wanted the Carillon Tower would represent a silo, that the courtyard would represent a medieval European church, where the church would set up this huge compound so that if there were marauders or fires or anything like that, people in the surrounding area would bring their livestock and their families into this courtyard. So this courtyard represented that. And of course the sanctuary represents the barn, if you will. A great story, don't you think? But and Otis told it many times, but as far as we can tell, it has no basis in fact whatsoever. But feel free to pass it on. And when you do, and if you come with any good embellishments, let me know, because I'll add them to mine, and we'll continue with it. Okay, so let's see. We've got a couple of, and the Carillon didn't come out exactly as he originally planned. Great watercolors. Here is the Carillon being constructed. 8-sided, depends on how you count it. How many sides is the Carillon Tower? You count it from the inside, count it from the outside. We'll call it 8-sided. Some people call it 4, some call it 16. It's not exactly anything, so you can call it what you want. The Carillon Tower going up here, April 15th of 1931. The church is dedicated, and with a concert, a Carillon concert by a man with the name of Anton Breeze, B-R-E-E-S, not B-R-E-E-Z-E, who was a Carillonurist, and I may be making that word up too, in Florida at a large church there. The bells came from England and were cast in England. Here they are arriving in the Lincoln Depot area on flat cars, and there's Anton Breeze hammering away at the Carillon. The original Carillon, 171 feet tall, was the only true Carillon in Nebraska or any state which touched it. The reason for that is a Carillon has a very specific definition. It has to have a certain number of bells. They have to be played manually by striking keys, if you will, which are connected directly to the bells. So when we call the Carillon Tower at the university a Carillon Tower, we're not being accurate. It's played electronically. It doesn't have any bells, and it's played on the keyboard. The Carillon at First St. Paul Methodist now church is not a Carillon because it doesn't have enough bells. It is appropriately called a chime. It has 10 bells. So, okay. If you are careful in your definition, you can make anything you got a first. All right? It's like a baseball statistic. Every one of them is unique. Questions?
When I toured the first Plymouth and their Carillon Tower, I thought they said it was a fairly small town in Nebraska that had a second Carillon.
Well, there are lots of them around now. The question was that when she toured the Carillon that she thought there were others. Well, there are several around. The University of Kansas at Manhattan has one. There's one in Omaha, and I think it's University of Omaha. There's quite a few now. But at that point in history, supposedly, now I could be proven wrong again, but supposedly the only one in Nebraska or any state which touched it. But I will check. I know Kathy Johnson at the church is the Carillon historian and has written in great depth on it. The newspaper at that point in time said that 25,000 people attended the dedication Carillon. And I thought, whoa. You're coming up pretty close to the population of the city of Lincoln. Not certainly there, but then I saw a photograph which was taken from the top of the Carillon Tower out across the city. And as you looked off, for example, towards the west, solid people. In fact, solid in the two directions the picture was taken. Solid people standing, covering the sidewalks, the streets, the yards, everything. Absolutely solid with people. So, I don't know. That seems like a stretch, but you can't prove it one or the other. 25,000 in attendance, and certainly nobody counted, so who knows. There's the church and Carillon completed, and the tower at that time contained 48 bells. It now has more than that, 48 bells. The smallest of which was 130 pounds, the largest of which 4,592 pounds, the great bell. The Carillon Tower was enlarged and remodeled in 1968, and at that time they put in more bells. In fact, they added 10 bells in 1995, so it's got considerably more bells than it had originally. This is an outdoor pulpit which faces into the courtyard from the base of the Carillon Tower. It has been used for weddings. It has been used on Easter morning services and so forth, but not regularly. This is the top, and of course around the top, or I like to say the four figures represent Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Otis, but not quite true. And the bells that you see here on the exterior are not ringing bells. They are just simply for decoration. Then the third organ. We've had several organs through the years. This is the third organ that sits there now. In 1996, they put in a new, what they call the balcony organ, which is a separate organ console, so that they can use it while they're putting in the new organ. Ruth Amon was one of the major donors in this, $240,000, the Amon family and perhaps foundation. The person who gave the most money, however, for the foundation was the Lead Foundation. So it's often called the Lead organ. And this is a definite triumph on the part of Otis Young, because when he went to the Lead Foundation to have them give money for the organ, it was explained quite quickly that Ms. Hickson said, the Lead Foundation does not give money to any church, period. And that's just the way they were. Otis convinced Ms. Hickson that First Plymouth Congregational Church is not a church. Okay? It is a cathedral. It is the Lincoln Cathedral. And his argument was based around the fact that if they're, like the governor dies, the senator dies, something like that, at that time it was the largest place that you could have a funeral, really. There are certainly many larger now, but that's where it would be held. And on the basis of that, plus the fact, this is something you may not have known, he stipulated, the Lead Foundation stipulated that that organ, if he paid for the major portion of it, any organist can play that organ at any time. So if you play the organ, you can go over to the church, and I checked that not too long ago, it's still true. You may play that organ. And that was part of Mr. Lead's rationalization, if you will. But at any rate, they got it. 11 stop, 15 rank gallery organ, and then the Lead organ, they call it, 97 through 98, manufactured by the Schoenstein Company in San Francisco, cost $2.2 million. 6,327 pipes, of which only a very tiny, tiny number are visible. The longest pipe is 32 feet long. The shortest pipe, 1/2 of 1 inch. 110 ranks now in the new organ, 85 voices or stops, and 9 divisions. Jack Levick, who was the organist at the time the organ was dedicated, the new organ, said that he thought it was probably the finest organ west of the Missouri River, which includes, by the way, the organ at the Salt Lake Temple. So that's covering a lot of ground. And I don't know. I have no idea. It's pretty good, and it's pretty loud when they pull all the stops on it. This is you can't see it anymore, but that's the exterior. The church today looks very much as it did then. It's had 2 additions, actually several small ones, one to the east and one to the north. And that was more than you wanted to know about that church, I'm sure. This picture comes to us from Matt Hansen. It's Matt's picture. He comes up with some dandies, usually eBay or someplace like that. This is the corner which will have ultimately on the Ledwith block on it. Mr. Ledwith was a grocer that owned the corner lots right there, the northwest corner of 11th and P Streets, which would be where the Embassy Suites sits today. Ledwith built the building over there in about 1887, and then we'll come along. He has a coal yard and his little grocery store still existing in there at that point in time. They come along and build this building in 1890, roughly, 1887, 1890 period. And it's a business block. It is not a hotel originally, but in 1891 he decided to alter it so that it could become the Merchant's Hotel, he called it. Had 65 rooms, and rooms were $5 a month. So, yeah. But it was primarily designed for traveling salesmen. It wasn't primarily designed for someone who came in to spend a night or so. So it's $5 a month and up. Who knows where it went from there. Then he will, in about 1908, remodel the hotel, rename it the Savoy Hotel, and it becomes then more of a night-to-night hotel, and it is built primarily as a vaudevillian hotel because the Orpheum Theater has just been built a block to the east. So he's going to solicit people who work for the vaudevillian entertainers to be staying here at the Savoy. The final 2 stories were added in 1911. And that's as we see it here. All of these buildings, of course, this is the famous Block 35. It's the only block in Lincoln for a long time that I knew the number of. And since then, it's become a little more universal. Fritz Wirk, not Fritz Craig, Fritz Wirk, the architect, when he came to Lincoln, his first charge was to remove that under sidewalk walk into the building. And made it into just a street level, as many did at that point in time. In the 1930s, it became known as the Sam Lawrence. Here we see it as the Savoy. And here we see it as the Sam Lawrence Hotel, named for the man who purchased it at that time. By then, it was $2 a night, so rates had gone up considerably. Sam Lawrence used to work for the Cornhusker Hotel. Wayne?
Didn't Charles Lindbergh stay at the Savoy?
The question was, did Charles Lindbergh stay at the Savoy? Charles Lindbergh stayed at every single hotel in the city and about half of the houses. And where he didn't, George Washington did. We keep seeing that all up and down P Street, and we see it as far out as 25th and 25th, 26th, and Van Dorn. Which, as a matter of fact, he apparently did stay at, because he was flying out of that field near the Lincoln Country Club. So we don't know exactly. He wasn't here long enough to spend as much time in it, even if he stayed one night in each room. He wasn't here long enough to have spent as much time as the place he stayed. But I can't argue with it. It sounds like a reasonable thing to suggest, but I don't know. Good question, and the correct answer. 1934, it's remodeled again. And he puts, at that time, Sam Lawrence puts a top floor on as a penthouse for his wife. So the entire upper floor, which is a pretty good-sized building, it was quite spectacular, supposedly, as a penthouse. This is the lobby of the hotel. And if you were in the restaurant that came along a little bit later, you would have seen all this marble floor and everything just exactly like that. This is one of the rooms upstairs. By 1975, the rates had gone to $9 a night, so it keeps going up and going up. Then Art Dershner and I, also an architect, in 1989, Art and I decided before something happened to the building, they'd already closed off the upper part, and McGuffey's had taken over the lower part as a restaurant. And Art and I knew the owner, and we went over and said we'd like to look at the upstairs. I wanted to see the top floor. I wanted to see if there's any remnant of this supposed penthouse up there. So Art and I were allowed to wander around in there. The elevator had been shut off and so forth. But this is the penultimate, and not the top floor. But there was nothing up there on the top floor or this floor, which indicated it was anything but a hotel. All of the windows were broken out. The place upstairs was covered with dead pigeons. It was just, terrible. So finally, 1975 is when the hotel closed. Then in August of 1990, it was torn down. And that's part of the Block 35 renovation, becoming nothing for a long, long time. It was an excellent example of a parking lot. That brings us to the end of our hour, and we will entertain questions here for a couple of minutes, if we got any. Robert.
There was absolutely no vestige whatsoever of the penthouse on top of the same.
Not that we could find. And of course, Art would have more ability to find those things than I did, but we couldn't find any evidence, that it had been so subdivided and remodeled that there was nothing left. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now that